Did you know that Charles Darwin came up with the theory of natural selection after sailing around the world on a ship called the Beagle? He observed animals and how they were best suited to their environments. Our lesson today is on evolutionary theory. So, Charles Darwin was a scientist who traveled on the Beagle, which was an exploratory ship, and he traveled around the world and took lots of anatomical drawings and plant and animal samples. And after he returned to England, he put everything into a book titled The Origin of the Species in 1859. And one of his main points of research was on the Galapagos Island finches. And he documented different selective pressures, like food and habitat availability, which resulted in the adaptation of new traits due to the availability of different food on these different islands. So during his travels, he made three different observations. One of them was that organisms produce more offspring that can survive, that variation exists among individuals of the same species, and that organisms compete with one another for limited resources. So, from these observations, he proposed the theory for natural selection. So, organisms best suited for their environment survive, reproduce, and pass on these traits. So, with the example of the finches, the birds that had the beak that was most likely to allow them to reach the food source on whichever island they happened to be, were more likely to survive. So with some finches, that was a big heavy beak because they were cracking nuts. For other finches, that was a long slender beak because they were um, eating nectar from plants or picking little bugs out of holes. So depending on the food source on the different islands, the birds developed different beak types. And because these birds weren't able to reproduce with each other over time, those adaptations became present in every member of an individual of that population, and those populations were no longer able to breed with each other, and then over time they became unique species. Another example is the peppered moth. So pre-industrial revolution, the peppered moth came in two colors, a mostly gray and a mostly white. And before the industrial revolution, that white moth was more common because it was able to hide on the bark of trees in the area. But then when coal was burned for energy and for industry, those trees were covered in a layer of ash and soot. So then the black gray moth, within a generation or two, was more likely to hide on the trees. So within a very short period of time, so thinking about that punctuated equilibrium again, that black gray moth became more common. Then when coal burning stopped, the gray moth became more common. It returned to being more common because the trees again had more white with a little speckled gray bark. So depending on the environmental conditions in the area, the black gray moth would be more common or the white gray moth would be more common. So natural selection is that organisms best suited to their environment reproduce and pass on these traits. And then this is the basis for the theories of evolution. So Darwin suggested that natural selection could also create new species through a process of speciation. So we have the theory of macroevolution, which is an explanation of how many slow changes over time created by natural selection eventually result in the creation of a new species. So the birds on the Galapagos Islands, head shape might change, their beak shape might change, their body size might change, and this happens slowly over time. Then there's a theory of microevolution, which is an explanation how many changes, small changes over time created by natural selection can result within change within species. And the reproductive success of an organism is now called Darwinian fitness. So again, the likelihood of an organism to survive, to pass on its traits to the next generation. So you'll often heard evolution also called survival of the fittest, and fittest means most likely to survive to breed. So in order for natural selection to occur, there must be a genetic basis for variation. This can't be, for example, in humans, the fact that people can dye their hair. That doesn't actually change your genetics, so it's not necessarily a requirement for natural selection. But in the animal kingdom, for there to be natural selection, there must be a genetic basis for the different traits, so the different bird beak sizes. This new trait must increase the rate of survival and or the rate of reproduction. So if those birds are more likely to find food, they're more likely to survive and reproduce. And the environment and or catastrophes also play an important role because the environment is what puts pressure on organisms to adapt and survive. So if a environment all of a sudden changes, you're going to see some natural selection in those populations because all of a sudden they have new living conditions. So Alfred Wallace came up with similar conclusions to Charles Darwin, but Charles Darwin published his book first, so we know his name better when it comes to the theories of evolution and natural selection. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, however, came up with an idea that organisms are able to change during their life to meet the challenges of their environment. So now this is an incorrect assumption. He believed things such as giraffes' necks became long because they stretched it during their lifetime, reaching for higher leaves. And then that stretched neck was able to be passed on. But we know this is incorrect. And an example in humans would be if a woman pierced her ears during her lifetime, then all of the children that would be born to her after she pierced her ears would come out with holes in their ears. Now, it sounds silly giving it that example, but that is an inaccurate assumption that Jean-Baptiste Lamarck made. So there's lots of evidence for the theory of evolution, and one of them is fossils, because they provide a history of the past, and we're able to see the gradual change in organisms over time through the fossil record. Embryology, which is the study of developing organisms in the first few stages of their development, and species that are related have similar looking embryos. And even when we look at things like a human and a lizard in the very first few weeks of development, we can see that they develop in a similar pattern with the same few structures developing first, and then obviously near the end, a great difference. But we can see that the lizard and the tortoise, being more closely related, continue with similar development for longer. The study of comparative anatomy shows that species that are related have structures that are similar. So these are structures that have a similar origin but different uses. So if we look at the arm structure of different mammals, they have the same bones in the same pattern, but those bones have been formed differently depending on what the organism does. So we have the long, skinny bones of a bat that enable the wing to be stretched out between the long fingers, compared to the bones of the cat, which are designed to be walked on, versus the bones of the whale, which have very short humerus and radius and ulna, because we need most of that length in the flipper. So they have a similar structure, but a very different function. So continuing with some evidence, we have also vestigial structures. Now, these are structures with no use, however, that the adaptations that cause them, they're adaptations, but the reason for them now has been lost. So this would be things like appendix or dew claws. Now, organisms have these. We don't really know their use, but at one point there must have been a use for them. Biogeochemistry, which is looking at the DNA of different organisms, and organisms that are more closely related have much more similar DNA. And lastly is biogeography. So we can look at organisms separated by geography that have similar characteristics, like the jaguar in Africa versus the panther in South America. And these are very similar organisms, but they don't interbreed, and they're different species. But they probably had a common ancestor. Now, we just want to, again, we had natural selection, and then another one is punctuated equilibrium that states instead of slow environmental changes causing natural selection pressure of an organism, we could have a very sudden change in the environment that forced organisms to adapt very quickly. So that's another theory of how organisms change over time. I hope you enjoyed the lesson on evolutionary theory. Take care.